Thank you very much, President Cardoso. I must say that it's a pleasure for me to be here in Sao Paulo. It's been one of the deficiencies of my education that I've been to Brazil but never to Sao Paulo. So now I'm remedying that. And I would most enjoy a conversation. So I'm going to speak very briefly. And since some of you heard me already once this morning, I will say things that I didn't say this morning or start in a different way. But I'd be interested to have a conversation on whatever is on people's minds. What I thought I'd start by in at most 5 minutes is telling you about the book that I'm writing now. And the book is called The Future of Power in the 21st Century, a very modest book. But it's a theme which obviously has intrigued me for some time, going back to this book, Bound to Lead, I wrote in 1990. At that time when I wrote the book, the general view in the United States was the Americans were in decline. Paul Kennedy, close to my neck. Paul Kennedy, who was my friend and the great historian, British historian at Yale, had said that the Americans were finished. We were going the way of Felipe II, Spain. It was all over. And I didn't think this was right. And so I was trying to think, how do you understand what power is and where it fits? And this is when I came up with this idea of soft power, which was the fact that after you looked at military power and economic power, there was still something else, the ability to attract. And that has taken on some currency. But I've been struck that from at that period in the late 1980s, when the view was the Americans were in decline, that was wrong. And then 10 years later, only 10 years later, there was a view that the Americans were on top of the world and can rule the world. And this was the neoconservative view that was expressed by the the Washington Post columnist Charles Krauthammer said it's a unipolar world and the Americans can do whatever they want because nobody else has any choice but to follow. I thought this was really stupid. And I wrote a book in 2002 called The Paradox of American Power. And the subtitle is Why the World's Only Superpower Can't Go It Alone. That didn't do much good because the Bush policy obviously went the other way. And now here we are in 2010, and the conventional wisdom, there's a poll recently, 60% of the American people think the United States is in decline. Now, that's quite remarkable. In 20 years, we've gone from thinking we're in decline to thinking we could do whatever we want to thinking we're in decline again. What that tells you is not much about power. It tells you about psychology. Something wrong with the psychology here. So what I was trying to do with this new book, which will be coming out in early 2011, I have to give it to the publisher on May 1st, is ask, what does power mean? How do you think about power? And how it might evolve in the course of this century. So the book essentially looks at the different definitions of power, but then it looks at military power, how that's changing, economic power, how that's changing, soft power, which I've mentioned, and then something new, cyber power. What does power mean in a world of cyberspace, where a little actor can do damage that a big actor can do, but you don't know who did it? And then from that, I'm going to what I call power diffusion, the fact that states are still the most important actors, but non-state actors have much more capacity now than they ever did in the past. So that think of it this way. If you look at what's happened with the power of computing, or the costs of computing, they've fallen 1,000-fold from 1970 to 2000. If the price of an automobile had declined as rapidly as the price of computing power. You could buy an automobile today for $5, which is what, 10 reales. And that is quite extraordinary. Any time that the price of something goes down that dramatically, then the barriers to entry go down. Anybody can play. So in 1970, if you wanted to have the capacity to communicate from Sao Paulo to Johannesburg to Beijing to Washington to Moscow simultaneously, all at once, you could do it. It's not that the technology is new, but it would be very, very expensive. To do that, you had to have the capacity of a big bureaucracy with a big budget, government, a multinational, maybe the Catholic Church. But now anybody has that power if you can have the price of going into an internet cafe. Last time I was in London, I saw internet cafe, 1 hour, £1. It's ridiculous. So anybody has this capacity, and if you have Skype, it's free. So anybody has capacities today which were reserved 30 years ago or 40 years ago to very big entities like governments or like multinational corporations. So there's a diffusion of power. So when we talk about these various capacities to attack, the love bug virus, which was launched by a hacker, an individual hacker in the Philippines, is said to have cost the world $15 billion in damages done. This is by one individual. This guy happened to have been caught. But lots of times these attacks, you don't know who did it. Was it the government of China? Was it a hacker in China? Was it somebody in Taiwan who sent it through a computer in China? We don't know. So this means that as you think about dealing with issues like this, it's very different. This diffusion of power creates a very different setting in the 21st century. Then you also have issues like global climate change. And climate change is, there's nothing that you can say it's this country or that country. It affects us all. So, if you ask, is China replacing the United States? Well, yes, it's now a superpower in the production of CO2. China last year exceeded the Americans in CO2 production. Now, that does damage to us in the United States, does damage to people in Germany, in Brazil, wherever. I mean, what can you do about it? Well, in traditional power terms, you say, well, I could use my military power. China is producing two new coal-powered plants a week. And they're putting all this CO2 in, and that CO2 is damaging us. I could use my military power. I could bomb these plants, stop them. Well, that's absurd. Well, what else could I do? I could put up a tariff against them. I could prohibit any trade with China unless they stop building these plants, use my economic power. Well, that would also be absurd. It would be self-damaging. Or I could try to help China develop capacities to get cleaner energy. And that has more promise to it than the first. Or, as China develops its own capacity, I could welcome it that it's there. So you start thinking of not just power over others, not just what can I do to change others in terms of my power over them, but power with others. If I want to cut down on CO2, I have to be able to organize networks of understanding and capacity so that we can deal with some of these problems. So a lot of these issues that arise from power diffusion are going to require a positive sum view of power, not power over, but power with. That's it's always been true, but it's going to be increasingly true because of power diffusion in the 21st century. The other part of the book, after looking at these power diffusion, is to look at power shifts, which is much more traditional. How does power shift among states? Who's becoming the largest power and so forth? And there the conventional wisdom is that China is going to replace the United States, and Goldman Sachs has even put a year on it. They've now said 2027. China's economy will be bigger than the U.S., and China will be the most powerful. This type of, I think this is a little bit silly because, for one thing, it's a linear projection. And anytime you make linear projections over 20 years, you're bound to be wrong. History has surprises. You don't know what's going to happen. But the second thing is that even if China is bigger than the U.S. in terms of its overall aggregate GDP, it won't be bigger than the U.S. in per capita GDP, which is a much better measure of the sophistication of economy until, 2066 or some such thing. I mean, way out into this century, if one believes in any of these linear projections. And so the argument that that China is going to be the biggest country because of this strikes me as having the flaw of linear projections and the inadequate measurement. But it also has another problem, which is it is unidimensional. It thinks of power as one thing, economic power, or GDP. In fact, if I go back and I ask about these different types of power, in military power, China is not going to be equal to the U.S. And if you look at soft power, what's interesting is that China has major problems in developing its soft power. A couple of things that are worth noticing there. It has to do with the internal nature of the Chinese system. Until the Chinese learn to loosen up, they're going to have trouble with their soft power. For example, China staged a very successful Olympics in 2008. Got a lot of soft power from that. The next thing they did was to have riots in Xinjiang and lock people up. And the next thing you know is they're locking up people in Tibet. All the gains in soft power in, let's say, in Europe that they made are washed out by that. There's a very interesting study done by a French institute that came out a few months ago, showing how China's soft power in Europe has been damaged by the fact that this repressive action hurts them. In addition to that, the Chinese can't tap their full creativity while they have censorship of the sort they have. I was in Beijing giving a lecture at Beijing University, for my friend Wang Jishe, who's the dean of the School of Public Policy there. And the students asked me, how can we increase China's soft power, since Hu Jintao said China should increase its soft power? And I said, ease up, relax. I said, look, you've got this problem. You have the problem of film. Look at India. Look at Bollywood. Bollywood makes more films than the United States, Hollywood. I mean, it's the biggest film producer in the world. China, 1.2 billion people. Are you telling me you don't have film producers and actors as good as the Indians in that large a population? Of course you do. But you're afraid to let them express themselves. They can't let their full imagination go. They can't do what they need to do. So I said, if you want to compete in these cultural areas, you've got to learn to relax, to ease up. But from the Chinese point of view, this is a huge threat. I mean, what you see in China is a communist party, which is, as the joke says, market Leninist. I mean, they want to use the market for legitimacy. I mean, so economic growth provides legitimacy, but they want to keep tight control, like an old Leninist party. And they're very afraid that if they loosen up, that essentially things will get out of control. Last year, the Chinese their own government published a figure of something like nearly 200,000 riots and incidents. Well, that's in a country that size, maybe not so bad, but imagine if some of those got connected together through the internet. It could make quite a difference. So they're very, very afraid about loosening up. But until they can loosen up, they're not going to have the soft power that the Americans have. So when you put these things together, and instead of just taking simplistic Goldman Sachs type of projections of 2027 for GDP in the aggregate equaling the Americans, and you say, what will happen with Chinese military power and Chinese soft power, as well as Chinese economic power, then I think it's much more questionable. My own guess, and nobody knows the answer to these things. I won't be around in 2027 to check this, but you can check it since many of you look like you'll still be around. But my guess is that the Chinese will get much closer to the Americans in power, but I doubt that they'll replace the Americans. And the reason for this is that their power is not as broad in these different dimensions, A, and B, if you're going to need more power with others, not just over others, the American capacity to form and maintain alliances over long periods, and the American capacity to work with international institutions and private institutions and create networks, and networks are essential for getting power with others, I don't think the Chinese are going to be up to that, unless they change. I mean, if the system changes, then maybe things will change. So as I look ahead into the 21st century, when people say, this is the Chinese century, just like the 20th century was the American century or whatever, no, I don't think so. I think what we're going to see is that we're going to think about power in somewhat different ways. We're going to be a little less worried about who's on top and more about who can we work with. And if you do go back to the question of who's on top, I don't think the Chinese are going to be on top ahead of the Americans. Anyway, that's what this new book is about, and I'm having a lot of fun writing it. But I must say that you never know with a book like this. Who knows, something happens and you say, oh, why did I write something silly like this? But fortunately, the one I wrote 20 years ago turned out to be okay. I sometimes joke that Paul Kennedy, who's a friend and I like him, I think on that prediction 20 years ago, I think Paul Kennedy got the answer wrong and I got the answer right, but he got all the royalties. So let me stop there and throw it over for conversation. But I'd love to hear more about Brazil, not just about China or the United States.